The mobile quarterback, otherwise known as the dual threat, has been described by Bleacher Report as, quote, the most complex position in sports. There's this stigma surrounding quarterbacks who can run. They are often thought of as injury-prone, less accurate passers, and lastly, having a lesser understanding of defenses. But despite the position being historically dominated by pocket passers, guys who don't run as much, the game is always evolving. NFL.com ranked the top quarterbacks of 2019. Of the top 5, 3, arguably 4, would be considered mobile quarterbacks. In what's been an afterthought to many NFL franchises, the idea of a mobile quarterback has started to shift from a novelty to a necessity. What's going on, everybody? I'm KTO, and maybe you've seen my face from my older videos, but due to some behind the scenes issues, including an endless supply of copyright claims, you'll be seeing my face more often. Don't worry, this isn't going to change my content too much. I'll still be using highlights and video clips. It'll just be a little bit different. But let's not waste any more time. Let's dive into this video's topic, the evolution of mobile quarterbacks. Based on my research, the evolution of mobile quarterbacks can be broken up into 5 separate eras, all of which have played a critical role in the change at the quarterback position. So let's take it back to the shift. Our story begins on the broad timeline from the 1940s to the 1960s. It had gone from guys like this, Sammy Baugh, who could play multiple positions, to guys like this, Bart Starr, who was a more refined pocket passer. One of the guys who had a major influence on this was Paul Brown, who was sort of the Bill Belichick of the early NFL. Some of his revolutionary ideas like playbooks and studying film changed the game from a, quote, physical exercise to an intellectual exercise. And by the late 1960s, the vast majority of coaches preferred a pocket passer over an athlete playing quarterback. There was no more need for a quarterback who could run. However, despite the game becoming more and more structured, there was one man who played just the opposite.
Tarkenton's going to throw. Looks like Randy White facing him. It looks like a ballet dance back there as Tarkenton gets away from everybody and finally does throw. Robert Miller gets the room. Jim Harris, the only man.
Fran Tarkenton was the king of backyard football, or the scramble drill, where the initial called play breaks down and receivers begin looking for ways to get open. Tarkenton would consistently make defenders look silly while buying time for the pass. The scramble drill has sort of become a normal routine in games and practice nowadays, but back then it was non-existent, and Tarkenton just kinda did it. When his career was said and done, not only was he the all-time leading passer in NFL history, he was also the all-time rusher for quarterbacks. That's almost certainly never going to happen again. Tarkenton's style was truly one of a kind, a style that can be described simply as a quarterback who uses their ability to run to open up the pass. Even though we really wouldn't see another guy like Tarkenton for a long time, there was a scrambler for every generation moving forward. But to move on, by the 1970s, the NFL sort of reached this experimental era for mobile quarterbacks, specifically the Chicago Bears with Bobby Douglas and the New England Patriots with Steve Grogan. Let's talk about Bobby Douglas. I found this quote done on him by NFL Films. Douglas rarely looked good when dropping back, but when running forward, he was in a class by himself. He was one of those guys that many people said that he should have played defensive back or another skill position due to his athletic ability, but the Bears insisted on making him their quarterback. And in 1972, he set the single season rushing record for quarterbacks. Douglas had his moments, but overall, he was never that great. In fact, he threw twice as many interceptions as touchdowns, and he never had a single winning season. Things went a little differently for the other experiment in the 1970s. In a time where the New England Patriots were one of the worst teams in the league, they decided to try something new in 1976. The Patriots officially moved off former number 1 overall pick Jim Plunkett in exchange for the run-first-minded Steve Grogan. And in 1976, the Patriots committed to a triple option-like offensive attack led by Grogan. Grogan's speed and elusiveness helped him set the NFL single-season rushing record for touchdowns by a quarterback, and he led the Patriots to an incredible 11-3 record, the most in franchise history up to that point. Despite losing in the playoffs that season, the success of their offense continued. In 1978, they would set the NFL record for team rushing yards, a record that would stand until 2019 when the Baltimore Ravens, who also ran an experimental offense, broke that record. But here's the downside to that offense. Grogan would suffer some pretty ruthless hits, and by the later half of his career, he had developed into a full-time pocket passer and really didn't run the ball that much in the second half of his career. By the 1980s, the NFL was becoming much more refined in their studying of offenses, and defensive players were becoming more athletic in general, so there was no more scramble drill for guys who ran 4.9 40s like Tarkenton. And the idea of a running quarterback was even more frowned upon after the failed experiments of the 1970s. Most quarterbacks had to fit the mold of the fundamental pocket passer. As an example of this, listen to what Warren Moon had to say about his combine.
Is it true that you ran a slow 40 time once because you did not want people thinking of you as a dual threat quarterback?
I did that with my pro 40 times.
Really
the pros come in. I knew that if I ran too fast, they would be wanting to change my position because I had already heard that was the thinking.
Warren Moon didn't exactly have what you would call a normal career. He came out of college in 1978 and was overlooked by the NFL, so he went to the Canadian Football League. In the next 5 years, he would win 5 Grey Cup championships in a row. That's the CFL equivalent of winning the Super Bowl. That's when NFL teams finally took notice, and 1 year later, he was picked up by the Houston Oilers. He would go on to have a storied career in the NFL, and he would retire as a Hall of Famer in both the CFL and the NFL, which makes him the only player ever to do so, and it's highly unlikely that that will ever happen again. The thing was, he wasn't even a dual threat quarterback. It's just funny that he said he ran slow on purpose. It just shows what the times were like back then. Now, back to our timeline. Even with the rise of air raid offenses and almost all quarterbacks falling into the mold of the fundamental pocket passer, something spectacular took place in Philadelphia.
Good play there. First and 10 at midfield. Play action. Cunningham gets by Butts. And this is what the Redskins don't like at all. And Randall Cunningham is now racing for the end zone. One man to beat, and he's knocked out of bounds at the 5.
In what started as an experimental third down quarterback, the Eagles realized they could no longer say no to Randall Cunningham, who had become the most explosive player in football by 1987. To put it simply, Cunningham had more talent and was more athletic than any quarterback before him. He was faster than defensive backs, had incredible knowledge of the game, and could make some downright ridiculous throws that would leave defensive coordinators begging for mercy. The year 1990 is when it all came together. Cunningham would set the new single-season rushing mark for quarterbacks with 942 yards, and he would also rank second in the league in touchdown passes and 6th in passing yards. And what blew my mind about this was he didn't win the MVP that season. Joe Montana beat him out. And when you look at their stat lines, it's absolutely insane that Cunningham didn't win it. But anyways, let's move on. Cunningham had introduced this whole new way of how to play the quarterback position, a category that I have coined the athletic freaks. And following him, Steve Young became the next closest thing. Although he wasn't the same caliber athlete, Young was no slouch. In fact, he ran a 4.5 40, that of an average NFL receiver. And he had incredible sense when he ran with the football. He was able to join a 49ers team who was in the latter half of their dominance and still led by Hall of Famer Joe Montana, and yet Young stepped in and made them better.
Young, back to throw. In trouble, he's going to be sacked. No, gets away. He runs, gets away again, goes to the 40, gets away again, to the 35, cuts back at the 30, to the 20, the 50, the 10. He dives, touchdown, 49ers.
Steve Young had given the Niners the confidence to ship out Joe Montana and eventually led them to a Super Bowl victory. Steve Young had proven that mobile quarterbacks could work, given the right system and pieces around him. He retired with the highest passer rating in NFL history, and by the mid-1990s, the league was well aware of seeing what dual-threat quarterbacks were capable of. At this point, there was no turning back. The 1995 NFL Draft turned out to be one of the most important in league history. With the 3rd overall pick, the Houston Oilers selected dual threat Steve McNair out of Alcorn State. Steve McNair was one of the most publicized stories in football that year. He had put up video game-like numbers at Alcorn State, enough so to make him a Heisman candidate at a Division I AA school, which, for those of you who know, that's crazy. Michael Strahan, former Giants defensive end and NFL Hall of Famer, played against him in college and said that he was a, quote, linebacker playing quarterback. McNair was big, 6'2", 230, was fast for his size, and was a great thrower of the football. One of the interesting parts of his story was he was one of the successors to Warren Moon, who had been in Houston for a decade. Although Moon was great during his time in Houston, McNair was able to do one thing that no other quarterback in franchise history was able to do, and that was lead them to a Super Bowl. Although the Titans would end up a yard short of a Super Bowl victory, McNair's impact will never be forgotten.
Oh, what a play by Steve McNair.
With 13 seasons, multiple Pro Bowls, a Super Bowl appearance, and the MVP in 2003, Steve McNair was the catalyst of the 3rd type of mobile quarterback, the thick beasts. More thick beasts would follow. In 1999, Donovan McNabb and Dante Culpepper were drafted a few spots apart from each other. Looking at their massive size combined with their ridiculous 40 times and a linebacker playing quarterback is the perfect way to describe these dudes.
Culpepper looks for Moss, can't find him, now takes off. Now throws for Moss. Touchdown!
He's 12. The play fake, McNabb flushed out of the pocket. Inside the 10, to the goal line, touchdown!
They were fast enough to evade you, big enough to run over you, and had the ability to throw over the top of you. All 3 went on to have success in the NFL.
There's no fuzz on this, Eagle.
Donovan shaves with chunky soup.
Now, let's transition to see what sort of athletic freaks the NFL had at this time. The same year that Steve McNair was drafted 3rd overall, Cordell Stewart was a 2nd-round pick. Cordell Stewart was a guy who was so athletic that he could have been a 1st-round pick on his talent alone, but he chose to stick to playing quarterback. Thus, he dropped a little bit in the draft. The Pittsburgh Steelers, who initially had him playing multiple positions, eventually supported the idea of him as a full-time QB. Once they committed to that, Stewart had moments of brilliance, including leading the Steelers to a pair of AFC Championship games. But ultimately, inconsistencies and dealing with multiple offensive coordinators derailed his career. Now we move on to 2001, a pivotal moment when it comes to dual threats. With the number 1 overall pick in the 2001 draft, the Falcons selected Michael Vick. With a skill set that was completely opposite of the fundamental pocket passer, some may have questioned whether or not Vick should have gone 1st overall. As to why he did, well, you didn't have to watch too much film to understand that. Vick was the most athletic quarterback, arguably player the league had ever seen. His speed and elusiveness were unrivaled, even compared to Cunningham. But along with that, he had an absolute cannon for an arm. Vick was such a superstar that he instantly became the most popular player in the NFL and one of the biggest stars in American sports in general. Along with becoming the first quarterback to ever rush for 1,000 yards in a season, Vick's influence on quarterbacks today is unrivaled. Now we enter the last decade, the 2010s, a time where mobile quarterbacks were commonly high draft picks and make up for more and more starting quarterbacks in the NFL year after year. Here are some experimental offenses that worked. Tim Tebow and his unorthodox style, Cam Newton and their run-heavy offense, you had RG3 and the RPO, Colin Kaepernick and the pistol offense, and lastly, Mr. Scramble Drill, Russell Wilson. One of these is unlike the others. While the first 4 I mentioned all had success, it was either inconsistent or short-lived. Remember how I said earlier that there wasn't another guy like Fran Tarkenton for a long time? Well, Russell Wilson is basically the modern-day version of him. The difference being that Wilson is faster, quicker, and more refined than Tarkenton. Another way to look at it would be taking our first 2 categories, the scramblers and the athletic freaks, and combining them into one ridiculous hybrid. Throughout his career, he has broken the 3 stereotypes I mentioned at the beginning. Number 1, he's never missed a game in his entire career. Number 2, he has one of the highest passer ratings in NFL history. And lastly, number 3, I'm going to defer to number 2 on this one. With his elite pocket presence, along with his unique ability to escape the pocket and throw on the run, Russell Wilson has become the shining example of what dual threat quarterbacks can be. That brings us to now. With the unknown of what this next decade of football will bring, we can only speculate as to what will happen next. We may see a renaissance for Cam Newton in New England. We may even see Taysom Hill get a bigger role moving forward. But going back to what I said in the beginning, mobile quarterbacks have started to shift from a novelty to a necessity. And this is just the beginning. We have seen the scrambler version of dual threats win Super Bowls for generations. Moving into this next decade, it's only a matter of time before we start to see other mobile quarterbacks start winning as well.
Here's a second down and 3. Jackson takes it himself. Look at him turn back